The next item of business is a debate on motion 18767, the name of Richard Lochhead, on the impact of the UK Government's planned immigration policy and mobility restrictions on Scotland's university and science research sectors. Can I ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now? And I call on Richard Lochhead to speak to and move the motion. Minister, please, 12 minutes.
Presiding Officer, a no-deal exit from the EU is the worst option for science. These are not my words, but those of the President of the UK Royal Society, Nobel laureate Venka Ramakrishnan. He was speaking in reaction to the UK Government's recently announced plans to fast-track visas for top researchers after Brexit. This latest proposal, like so many others put forward by the UK Government in recent weeks, has been the subject to scepticism from key voices across the further higher education and science sectors, and for good reason. Any proposal that seeks to encourage the recruitment and retention of scientists and researchers is, of course, to be welcomed. However, the positive impact such proposals might have will be minuscule compared to the overall damage stemming from the UK Government's fanatical pursuit of a Brexit at any costs. Damage that will be compounded by what is currently engulfing the UK Government, and that is, of course, chaos.
Oliver Mundell.
The Minister for giving way, but it's a bit rich to come here to this chamber and say that it's my party that are pushing for a no-deal Brexit when not a single SNP MP voted for the deal on the 3 occasions it came before the Westminster Parliament.
Minister.
Only the Scottish Conservative Party could say there's no chaos happening in Westminster at the moment. It's there for everyone to see within his own divided party as well. But I doubt anyone in this chamber has ever experienced anything like what we are currently seeing in Westminster. While members of the new Prime Minister's Cabinet recline on the benches of the House of Commons or even shut down Parliament, staff, students and researchers at our institutions are crying out in concern for their livelihoods and their futures. Meanwhile, I met with a revolving door of UK counterparts. I'm on my third now, and I've only been in office for 1 year, and I didn't even get to speak to my third UK counterpart. And they just seem to nod in agreement with what the sector are saying, but whose ability to actually implement decisions appears throttled by those above their pay grade. And I hope, Presiding Officer, in contrast, we can see a different example set today of what we're seeing in Westminster, one here hopefully of respect, trust and consensus. What is needed and what the sector needs is a calm and open consideration of all the facts. And the fact is this: Brexit and the UK Government's view on what its future migration policy should look like will be like a wrecking ball to our institutions in Scotland. In fact, as I'm sure many members are aware, the damage has already taken shape. I was recently at dinner with the Government of Lower Saxony just last week in Glasgow, it so happens, where I was told that their universities are seeing an unprecedented increase in the number of German academics based in the UK applying for positions back home now. Similarly, the Russell Group have reported an ongoing decline in the number of EU academics working at UK institutions. This loss of talent, of which there are many, many anecdotes and lots of evidence, may be a trickle now, but it could become a tsunami if we leave the EU and lose access to freedom of movement. Scientists and researchers, as we've debated many times before, rely on freedom of movement to allow them to move quickly and easily between projects. Some international academics will come to Scotland for only a few months at a time, perhaps, to help deliver vital, life-changing research before moving on. Others stay for a lot longer. Anything that puts up barriers to this flow of people and ideas, for example, a restrictive UK government migration environment, would make the UK a far less attractive place for globally mobile researchers. This is intrinsically linked with issues around research funding as well. Along with the movement of staff and movement of ideas, the movement of funding in the form of international competitive research grants is the bedrock of the modern scientific research sector that we are lucky enough to have here in Scotland. Research income leveraged through international funding streams is a mark of excellence and can often attract research income from elsewhere. The third sector, for example, invests significant amounts of money in Scottish research, and now one of the world's largest research funding charities has raised concerns around the impact of Brexit on its future potential investment. The Wellcome Trust, which of course is based in the UK...
Ms Martin.
Would the Minister like to tell us what impact he thinks this will have on the ordinary undergraduate student in our Scottish universities as well, not having access to this experience from across the EU?
Minister.
Well, potentially it could be devastating, both firstly for our universities and institutions, given that students from the EU and indeed internationally may find the UK, and in our case Scotland, much less attractive a destination to come and study and visit and indeed potentially work in because of the message they're receiving from the UK government. And likewise for investment and research funds, if we're locked out, as I'm about to talk about shortly, of the European research funds, which are very substantial, that will have a detrimental impact on the viability of courses in some cases and indeed the sustainability of our university and research sectors. But in terms of the Wellcome Trust, which is based in the UK, it has a £25.9 billion global investment portfolio. I'll just repeat that, £25.9 billion, the fourth highest in the world. And its director, Jeremy Farrar, has stated, "We have invested in the UK for more than 80 years. It has provided an environment in which science and innovation can thrive. But if the conditions and the culture here are damaged, that will affect our support. It is not unconditional." And what he's referring to is the hostile environment being created by the UK government and the future difficulties institutions in the UK will face in attracting that talent we've just discussed, in collaborating and winning research funding, as I said as well. This includes funding, for example, from Horizon 2020, the EU's flagship research fund, from which Scotland has competitively won almost €650 million to date. €650 million. Access to this fund is of critical importance to researchers, just as is the ability to easily travel from project to project. Without access to both, easy access with no obstacles to both, researchers are likely to look elsewhere. And it's a similar situation with students. Scotland is already regarded as a renowned study destination across the whole of Europe. I was speaking to some students at the University of Dundee this morning who were reiterating how warmly welcomed they feel in Scotland and the benefits they have from their unique courses at the University of Dundee in this case. And proportionally, more EU students come and study in Scotland than elsewhere in the UK. Our campuses are diverse, international, and incubator for different ideas and viewpoints shaped by people's international backgrounds and experience. And all of that has been underpinned by the ease with which EU students can come to our colleges and universities. In a report mentioned before in Parliament, but worth repeating, conducted by the University of Stirling Students' Union on the campus-wide impact of Brexit there, many EU students described a feeling of worry regarding their future status in the UK. Speaking to students the length and breadth of Scotland, these are concerns I've had echoed time and time again during my visits. The possibility of restrictive or expensive visa conditions for future study were cited by some as a reason for looking elsewhere in the EU when considering postgraduate study. And hostile conditions, of course, that international students from outside the EU already face, to the detriment of our institutions, are other factors as well. Being made to apply for something like the current Tier 4 student visa, which can cost over £1,000 when studying in another EU country would typically cost nothing, is clearly going to be an enormous disincentive for EU students. Enormous. Yet this is the kind of situation these students may find themselves in if we are to lose access to freedom of movement as the UK government, the Conservative government, plans and takes pride in announcing. Now the UK government's proposed no-deal contingency measure, a European temporary leave to remain scheme, would grant EU citizens up to 3 years leave in the UK before they have to apply and pay for another visa. But, as we all know, Scottish undergraduate degrees in this country last 4 years, not 3 years. Medicine degrees, other degrees, can last a lot longer than 3 years. Students who go on maternity leave will often study, for instance, for more than 3 years as well. So this scheme is discriminatory against Scottish institutions and against any person who does not fit into the 3-year degree mould that's been shaped in Whitehall. Now, I've laboured this point with the UK government time and time again. Hopefully I'll have a fourth UK counterpart to repeat the points to shortly. And yet, the policy doesn't change. It's bizarre, Presiding Officer, for the UK government to profess that having the needs of our institutions is in their minds when they repeatedly present plans that are in direct contradiction to the sector's best interests. We see this outside of Brexit too. Over 8,000 graduates took part in the Fresh Talent Working in Scotland scheme between 2005 and 2008, which I remember as here celebrating all those years ago. And this scheme allowed for international graduates of Scottish universities to stay in the UK, to live and work for up to 2 years after the end of their studies, and was seen as a success by both the Scottish Government and the sector, and I believe all parties in this chamber. And then the UK Government got rid of that, subsuming it into another policy and then eventually abolishing it altogether in 2012. The Scottish Government and the sector have been adamant since then that its return is essential to help keep up with our international competitors. And that's a view that was indeed shared by the Smith Commission. And what's more, it's a view shared by members again across this chamber. The Post-Study Work Steering Group, established in 2014 and composed of representatives from all the parties in the Parliament, concluded that there was clear support across businesses and the whole of the sector for the reintroduction of a post-study work route. Then in 2016, the Home Office released details of a low-risk Tier 4 pilot. This pilot grants master's students an additional 2 months' leave after their course has ended in order to seek work. 2 months. 2 months, not the 2 years. So that doesn't amount to anything like the post-study route the sector is calling for. And more recently, we have seen the UK Immigration White Paper proposals to extend post-study leave for bachelor's and master's graduates to 6 months and up to a year for those awarded PhDs. So that is a step in the right direction, but it still falls far short. And if there are to be more announcements this week and the coming weeks, we need to see what we're calling for in terms of this post-study work visa delivered to the full. And especially when we compare what's on offer in this country compared to what international competitors are offering at the moment. Canada's postgraduate work permit, for example, is valid for up to 3 years, while Australia's post-study work visa allows for up to 4 years right to remain. In the UK Government's recent international education strategy, meanwhile, they've expressed an ambition to increase education exports to £35 billion by 2030. And we all know it's a competitive field out there in terms of international student recruitment, so the proposals outlined in the immigration paper are not exactly game changers. And of course, things change so fast in Westminster, we're not even quite certain what current UK Government policy is on this issue. But given the lack of detail and certainty, it's hard to see how the figure of £35 billion will ever be met. So all this relates back to what I was talking about earlier on, which is all the chaos at the heart of the UK Government's thinking. They don't seem to know what it is they want or how to get there. They want to make it harder for talented staff and students to come to this country, but at the same time they want to increase our share of international recruitment, they say. They want to end our access to freedom of movement, but at the same time express a desire to make the UK an inviting place to come and work and study. Well, in contrast, the Scottish Government has a clearly articulated policy based on evidence and supported by stakeholders. We need a competitive post-study work offer like we had in the Fresh Talent scheme. We need a tailored migration policy that's flexible and tailored to Scotland's distinctive needs. A policy that's frictionless, that's no cost barriers, that does not represent any burdens to our institutions, staff or students. The sector supports that, businesses supports that, staff and students who want to come and contribute to Scotland support that, as I was hearing today in Dundee. So we need to be able to get on and deliver that. Against the backdrop of a no-deal Brexit, our colleges, university and scientific research sectors face unprecedented challenges. They are one of Scotland's greatest strengths and are a key component of our resilience and in meeting future social and economic challenges. If they suffer, Scotland suffers. And that's why it's so important that any migration policy supports our institutions and allows them to thrive. So I invite the Chamber to join me in calling the UK Government to urgently rethink their policies on migration, to extend their no-deal leave to remain to a minimum of 4 years, and of course to reintroduce that 2-year post-study work visa for students in Scotland. I commend the motion to Parliament.
Two little housekeeping things to say. If you want to speak in a debate, it's handy if you press your request to speak button now. That's for 3 members who apparently are asleep. And secondly, there's some time in hand. If you want to take interventions, you'll make your time up till we run out of time in hand. And now call Oliver Mundell to speak to move Amendment 18767.1. Mr. Mundell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move the motion in my name, which, as members will note, is not that difference in substance from that put forward by the Government, with one notable difference at the end. And that's because we do agree with much of what the Minister said today, not always the tone, but with the substance. And I want to start in that spirit by welcoming this important debate and by doing something that will be novel to those sitting on the SNP benches and by the standards of this SNP government. And that is admitting and acknowledging that my party hasn't got everything right on this issue. And we hear hip hip hooray, but doesn't that just say, oh, we're interested in working constructively, because we recognise that attracting the best of global talent into our higher and further education and research institutions is vital to the success of the whole of our United Kingdom. And arguably, it becomes even more important as we leave the European Union. I was in favour of leaving the EU. I was one of over 1 million Scots to have voted to leave. That does not, however, mean that I want to see us sever our ties with Europe or see our country turn in on itself. In a dynamic, international and truly global economy, and in the proud Scottish tradition, we need the brightest and the best, not just to study here, but to stay here and help our country grow, both economically and in terms of our population, to collaborate and to contribute. And there is no good reason why that cannot continue to be the case. And here I do think the Prime Minister makes a very important point, and that is that relentless negativity helps no one. And I ask those on the SNP benches, what kind of person actually wants to see their own country fail in order to prove they're right? And what I can say on the... I won't take an intervention from the member at this point. What I can say is that on these benches, we are committed to working constructively to find solutions. Even though members on these benches have been on different sides of the debate, we all respect the result and find common cause in making the best of the opportunities Brexit brings and mitigating the challenges that we see. Yep. I'll take one from the Minister first.
Minister.
In light of the consensus being fostered by the member, does he agree that a no-deal scenario is the worst possible outcome for Scotland's further education, higher education and research sectors, and therefore should not be voted for at any point and should be resisted at every stage?
Oliver Mundell.
Well, I'm delighted to hear the Minister confirm that after dragging their heels, the SNP will support a deal, because that's what the sector needs. We could have had all of these problems tied up and sorted by the 31st of March. And I think it's depressing when we hear the Minister talk about a trickle of people leaving in the face of uncertainty. When we could have had certainty, when we had a good withdrawal agreement on the table that would have allowed us to move on and address these issues. And that's not to ignore the issues we discussed today or pretend that they don't exist. It's simply to question how, in a tough political climate, we choose to approach such issues. And as many members will know, my colleague Liz Smith has consistently voiced concerns in this area and advocated for changes. I know she's already raised the matter with the new Secretary of State for Education, Gavin Williamson, and I'm confident that the UK Government is listening. And I would just gently say to the Minister, if he wants to talk about revolving doors, he might reflect on how he got his own position. But I don't want to get too political at this point, because I'm all for building consensus and working together where we have shared goals and a common interest. Yes.
Cabinet Secretary.
In trying to steer Mr Mundell away from the politics of all of this, I'm interested in his line of argument, because he's making a very strong argument, with which I agree, about the need to attract people to come to this country. And I know that Liz Smith has fought consistently on these questions. Could he tell us how he believes the stance on migration of the Conservative government up until now has contributed to that process? Because from my perspective, I think the stance on migration of the Conservative government is putting people off coming here in terms of its message and practically. So does he think there is a need for a change in the attitude on the migration question from the Conservative government, which would allow us to perhaps realise some of the objectives he's talking about here?
Oliver Mundell.
No, I welcome that point. I think that's what we've already seen from the new government under a new Prime Minister, that there's been a reset in approach. And I think that it's about balancing the different interests, because not only do we need to look at immigration from inside the EU, we need to look at how our immigration system attracts those from right round the world and ensures that we're attracting those with the skills that our economy needs to grow. And that's exactly why the university sector itself is so important, and why we're getting behind what appears to be a cross-party consensus today in the actions that we need to see. And these are important issues for our whole society, because the university sector is one of the backbones of the modern economy. And if we want to attract new people to come and live and work in this country, We need to see our economy growing, leading the world, and I think that research and innovation is right at the heart of that. But to break the consensus for a second, I think we do need to go back to the fundamental point here, which is this situation could have been avoided. I think there are some here today ringing the alarm bells who have to look themselves in the mirror and ask what role they've played in trying to build consensus and give those in the sector and in wider society the length and breadth of our country the certainty they were looking for. Yeah.
Stuart McMillan.
I thank Mr Mandel for taking the intervention. Just on that issue then, in terms of the consensus, what is the deal that Mr Mandel actually wants to see happen that would actually have that consensus across all of the parties that are represented in the House of Commons?
Oliver Mandel.
Well, I think we've already seen something that forms that deal. That was the withdrawal agreement. I voted to leave. I might have looked for more from that deal in terms of how far removed we were from EU spheres. But I recognise that that was a compromise. That was something in the middle that should have appealed to sensible people right across the political spectrum. And sadly, I think that there are too many on both sides who, as I say, are responsible for the mess we find ourselves in now. And I think on these benches, we've clearly and consistently supported calls for a Brexit deal that protects our university sector and the other sectors that are so important to our economy. That we could have drawn a line under the bitterness and division we've seen over the last few years and created the political space to focus on not just some of the challenges, but some of the real opportunities we face as a global leader in education. I'm in my last minute.
Yes, I think so. Very good of you. Take lots of interventions, which is good, but I think the member has to begin winding up. Thank you.
And I think that is it in conclusion, Presiding Officer, that the SNP, despite all their protests, have had the opportunity to deliver a Brexit deal and protect our universities, our businesses, farmers, people the length and breadth of Scotland on 3 occasions. Each time they've rejected the deal. Every time the Scottish Conservatives in this Parliament have advocated for it. And indeed, every single Scottish Conservative MP voted for it in March. So whilst we agree that we need to address the challenges that have been outlined in the motion, we didn't need to get to this point, and people should have a think about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mandel. I now call Ian Gray. Mr Gray, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to speak in this debate today on what is, of course, a key issue for our universities, our research community and our economy. What is unwelcome, though, indeed ridiculous, is that it is an issue in the first place. Back on the 7th of November last year, we debated the safeguarding of Scotland's research collaborations in the light of Brexit, and it's regrettable that the concerns raised then have been largely ignored. On that occasion, I quoted Einstein, who said, "Only 2 things are infinite, the universe and human stupidity, and I'm not sure about the former." And I fear that the intervening months have really only seen the evidence of the stupidity of Brexit in general, and its management by the Tory government in particular stack up yet further. We've been told that freedom of movement would end on the 31st of October, then we were told that it wouldn't. Parliament is suspended, the Prime Minister is in apparent defiance of the law, and the uncertainty we talked about in November now exponentially increases. A recent report from researchers at Robert Gordon University highlighted starkly that the uncertainty surrounding immigration status after Brexit is already having a detrimental impact on the mental health and well-being of EU citizens. A shameful situation created by the incompetence of the Tory party, and one which will contribute to the problem which Mr Swinney was describing a moment ago of the unattractiveness of this country as a place, particularly for EU citizens to choose for their life and work. There can be no doubt that our higher education sector and our scientific research community is world-leading. Despite facing cuts of around 11% from the Scottish Government and these high levels of uncertainty due to Brexit, they continue to produce world-class, groundbreaking research in all areas, from humanities to AI and medicine to engineering. Researchers in Scotland's institutions lead the way, and we must do all we can to allow them to continue to do so. But there can be no doubt that this is massively underpinned by the contribution of staff and students from the EU and beyond. The briefing provided for this debate by University Scotland tells us that over 10,000 of our university staff are non-UK nationals, and 47%, almost half, of university staff who work on research alone are from overseas. Over 54,000 of our students are international, most of them from beyond the European Union, and therefore critical to the income of our institutions, to say nothing of the international reputation of our higher education sector, of which we are so proud. We should indeed be striving in the United Kingdom to create a welcoming and open environment to the next generation of researchers and students. Instead, there is little doubt that the arbitrary and punitive salary thresholds, bureaucracy and cost associated with proposed immigration changes will harm the workforce and the ability of our research community to attract the skills it needs in what is, after all, a transient and mobile global sector. Meanwhile, the no-deal threat of a transitional scheme, which, as the Cabinet Secretary pointed out, fails to notice that Scottish degrees are 4 years long, would leave students unsure that they will be able to complete their studies, and is perhaps the worst example of that stupidity which frankly seems to be this Tory government's specialist subject. The truth is that if we look at existing immigration policy, our higher education institutions often find it already not fit for purpose. Let me mention a very specific problem with that. Scotland has a rich and diverse PhD community who deserve the chance to work in our institutions and take full advantage of the opportunities available to them. Currently, though, social science PhDs in Scotland on a Tier 4 visa cannot take up internship opportunities provided by the Scottish Graduate School for Social Science due to working hours restrictions and the Scottish Government policy on hosting them. And I know there has been some discussion between the governments on changing this, but I'd be grateful if the Minister could perhaps use a moment of his time to address the issue later on, so that all of our postgraduate researchers can get involved in contributing their expertise to organisations across the country. But if the current approach to immigration is not fit for purpose, what confidence can we have then in any new immigration bill coming forward? As University Scotland and Universities UK would tell us, that new immigration bill ought to be an opportunity to create a system that works for the higher education and research sectors, that supports PhD recruitment, that attracts the most highly skilled researchers, and that allows flexibility for research collaborators. But the truth is that, deal or no deal, we can have no confidence that the current government understands that, desires it, or is capable of delivering it. Instead, as with so much of the Brexit shambles, it rather daily stokes worry and uncertainty, and this Parliament must stand foursquare against that. Look, our view is that the best deal for higher education, as with so much else, would be to remain in the European Union. And the fact that the Conservative amendment tonight tries to suggest that that is an outcome which is no longer possible is the reason why we cannot accept their amendment, no matter how much sympathy it may have with some of the other issues which have been raised by the Cabinet Secretary. And that is the reason why we will back the government motion this evening.
Colin Ross-Greer to open for the Green Party. 6 minutes, please, Mr Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's timely that, as the only Parliament allowed to sit today, we hold the Westminster Government to account for their immigration policy and the impact that it will have on further and higher education in Scotland. As the chaos in Westminster continues, we hear increasingly alarming and anti-democratic language from the Prime Minister. That he would rather die in a ditch than request an extension to the Article 50 deadline, something he's now required to do by law. That he's exploring every possible way to circumnavigate that law, to deliver a no-deal Brexit. Despite the UK Parliament's best efforts, the prospect of crashing out of the EU without a deal remains a possibility. And that would be disastrous for universities and colleges in Scotland. Immigration and free movement have underpinned the success of our further and higher education sectors. Over 1/5 of university students in Scotland is from somewhere else. That's over 50,000 students, about 31,000 of whom are from outside the European Union. It's a higher proportion of international students than the rest of the UK, reflecting the world-leading status of Scotland's universities. The benefit of international students coming here is not just limited to those individuals, of course. They enrich our society and contribute to the local and national economy. They bring new cultural experiences and ideas and integrate them into Scottish society. They contribute to developing a more outward-looking Scotland, open to the world and comfortable with our place in it. Many international students also settle in Scotland after their studies, using their expertise and skills to benefit this country. They often fill some of the acute skills gaps that we suffer from. Over 30% of academic staff at our universities are themselves from outside of Scotland, rising to almost half of research staff. This international expertise has ensured that Scotland remains a leading centre of research and innovation. It has driven huge international investment in R&D here. This means institutions like Edinburgh University's Scottish Centre for Regenerative Medicine and Strathclyde's Technology Innovation Centre, which is part of the International Technology and Renewable Energy Zone in Glasgow, have benefited immensely from international expertise and funding. And I would commend both of them to all members as being well worth a visit. They're excellent examples of the benefits of European collaboration. But we're all here today because all of this is threatened by the Conservative government at Westminster. As we edge closer to leaving the European Union, with or without a deal, we run the serious risk of seeing the UK's cruel and destructive immigration policies and the dysfunctional, arbitrary administration of those policies expanded to EU citizens who are currently shielded by their rights under freedom of movement. This is the immigration policy that has seen people deported to their deaths. It's denied child trafficking victims the right to stay in the UK. Whistleblowers have even accused the Home Office of having lied to other European states in order to deport victims of human trafficking against European law. This summer, the Home Office was called out by 70 senior university research centre leaders for repeatedly refusing visas for researchers from Africa, including Ebola researchers from Sierra Leone. What on earth was the value, what on earth was the benefit to the UK of denying visas to those researching that disease? Hundreds of thousands more people in Scotland would be subject to immigration rules designed to force them out and to drain their income in the process. The hostile environment policy, which continues to this day, has already given us the Windrush scandal. People with every right to be here had their lives ruined. They were banned from working, evicted from their homes, denied public support, in some cases denied medical support, and even deported to countries that they hadn't seen for decades, that they had no realistic connection with. While institutional racism was central to the Windrush scandal, one of the key issues that made that generation so vulnerable to the hostile environment was their lack of records, their proof of residence and who they are. They lacked those records because they didn't need them when they arrived, and they didn't need them for decades thereafter. They were simply not required in law at that time. Well, EU citizens have not needed those records either. They didn't have to apply to any state body to come to the UK. They simply exercised their treaty right to freedom of movement in the same way that many UK citizens have done elsewhere across our continent. And there is, of course, a new settled status scheme for EU citizens designed to give them those records. But I have no faith in the Home Office. Already I've seen cases of EU citizens who've been in this country for decades being denied settled status, allegedly for not having proof of residence, despite it being abundantly obvious, despite decades of paperwork to prove their case. There's a chance that the crimes the Home Office inflicted on the Windrush generation will be repeated on EU citizens. That's a chance that I'm just not willing to take, and I know that a majority of members in here feel the same way. We must not only dismantle the hostile environment, it's time that we abolished the Home Office to completely tear down the institutional racism that is embedded within it. It's imperative now more than ever that immigration policies are devolved to Scotland. Not just in recognition of the social, cultural and economic benefits brought here by immigrants, but in recognition of the injustice and the rampant criminality that has characterised the UK government's immigration policies. When we finally have control over immigration here, we must create a free and open system, one that seizes the opportunities citizens of the world have to offer us, and which respects the inherent dignity of all people, regardless of where they come from. It can be easy to fall into the trap of populist and even racist rhetoric. It's something that's infected many parties, though it's the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats who are directly responsible for the hostile environment through the 2014 Immigration Act. Until such time as we're responsible for our own immigration and asylum systems, I support the measures contained within the government's motion. The 3-year temporary leave to remain proposal clearly doesn't take into consideration Scottish universities. Amending it would be welcome. It's something the UK government could have done long before now. However, these proposals, along with the Fresh Talent Scheme, are only tinkering around the edges. They're damage limitation exercises at what is, at its core, a horrendously racist and discriminatory immigration system. Scotland's colleges and universities, our students and their staff, deserve so much better than this.
I'm very pleased to say that opening for the Liberal Democrats today in her first contribution to a debate in our Parliament is the MSP for Shetland, Beatrice Wishart. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to be here to make my first speech in this Parliament. Firstly, though, I'd like to pay tribute to my predecessor, Tavish Scott. Tavish dedicated 20 years to the people of Shetland and to this place, and I'm sure you would all like to wish him well in his new role at Scottish Rugby. In my time working in his office, I saw firsthand Tavish's dogged determination to make sure that decision makers did not forget about Shetland. I also saw that advocating for island interests can often be an uphill battle in this Parliament. But Tavish also always persevered. The Air Discount Scheme, Island Travel Fund, repatriation of NHS services, and even the Shetland mapping requirement will all be legacies of Tavish's time in office. Tavish and I went to the same school at different times. I was reminded recently by a former head teacher of the motto of Anderson High School, do well and persevere. And just as Tavish persevered, so will I. I am glad to be making my debut speech on an issue that will have real consequences for Shetland's future prosperity. Shetland's my home and it matters to me. I grew up there. It's where I raised my children and where I hope my grandchildren will raise theirs. I'm proud to represent such a beautiful part of the world. That beauty will now be obvious to all those on the government benches who made the trip to Shetland for the by-election campaign. But beautiful scenery isn't enough to encourage skilled workers and students to make Shetland their home too. Shetland's always been welcoming and outward-looking. Our geographical position at the crossroads of the North Sea and North East Atlantic means that from Viking and Hanseatic trade routes to the modern fishing industry and energy sector, we've been connected to the global economy. We want to remain connected and attract the brightest and the best to make their homes here. We're in the midst of a merger that will bring together Shetland's further and higher education and training services under one organisation. And that has real potential to attract students from across Europe with the right support. And that could go some way to addressing the skills shortage that already exists in Shetland and in the UK. Last month in Lerwick, I visited Ocean Kinetics, a marine engineering and fabrication business, and Mesomorphic, a software design company. It was evident that businesses need more support to train and retain highly skilled people who can contribute to our local economy. But that's not just local experience. In July, the Open University Business Barometer reported that 63% of UK organisations are currently experiencing a skills shortage. Of more concern, though, is that 59% of senior business leaders thought that those shortages would worsen if the UK leaves the EU. I want to be clear that that is not acceptable. Presiding Officer, I have first-hand experiences of navigating the UK immigration system as an MP's caseworker, working through its complexity and bureaucracy, and that could be frustrating and heartbreaking. Applications refused on small technicalities that could have been sorted out with a phone call. Instead, a second application is required and the payment of more eye-watering fees. A cynic could be forgiven for thinking that's an easy way for the Home Office to increase fee income. And I'm angry for our European friends, many of whom have lived here for decades, who are being forced to apply for permission to stay in their homes and communities. They're being exposed to the Tories' hostile environment, and already too many aren't getting the status they're entitled to. After the shambles and brutality of the last week in Westminster, I have no faith that this Tory government will introduce any kind of compassionate immigration system in the future. And what's more, the way in which the UK government treated our fishing industry, on advice from the Migration Advisory Committee, suggesting that Antipodean gap year students could crew fishing boats. It's an insult to what is one of the most dangerous jobs in Britain. The Scottish Government is rightly calling on the UK Government to respect our 4-year university degree system. But, Presiding Officer, in turn, the Scottish Government needs to similarly step up and respect the challenges facing Shetland. There are things that can be done now to make the Isles an even more attractive place to live, work, study and raise a family. Good connectivity is essential. For years, islanders have told this government we need fair and full funding for our ferry services. That promise has not been delivered. And for years, islanders have been told to wait for 2021 for R100 to reach them with better broadband, and now that commitment's disappeared. And the effects of not having decent broadband are significant. If it takes 6 hours to download a Netflix film, just how are people supposed to access online study material? Access to good broadband is as much of a necessity in today's world as it is for other utilities like water and electricity. Young people will often leave Shetland for higher education and work and to experience the world, and that should be encouraged and facilitated. So while our next generation does that, it will be my mission in this Parliament to make sure that if and when they choose to return, Shetlanders are afforded every benefit that would have been available to them on the mainland. And the same goes for those from the mainland and beyond who want to relocate to Shetland, because Shetland is a good place to build a life too. Presiding Officer, I am ambitious for Shetland. As an MSP, I now intend to make sure that this government is too.
Now move to the open debate, and it's speeches of 6 minutes, please. We are a bit tight for time, so please take care in the length of your contributions. And I call Claire Adamson to be followed by Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Presiding Officer, can I thank Beatrice Wishart for her first speech in the Parliament, congratulate her on that. It was a very passionate one, and I can see Shetland won't be forgotten in the Chamber going forward. So thank you for that. Can I set out my personal passion for education, science and Scotland's place at the centre of world-leading research? It gives me great sadness to have to be talking this afternoon about an immigration policy of Westminster's making, which has the potential to do so much damage to the international standing and reputation of our higher further education institutes. After all, it was Scotland's very own Winnie Ewing, Madam Cos, who worked so hard to establish the Erasmus and Comenius programmes, also at risk from Brexit, because she knew how vital that exchange of knowledge and people across Europe will be. And while I do welcome the calls for consensus across the Chamber, I do have to regret that the Tories' actions in this area have not been good. After all, as mentioned by Ian Gray and by Ross Greer, the Fresh Talent Initiative was an initiative made in Scotland to meet the requirements of our institutions. It was delivered under Jack McConnell's premiership in this Parliament, and it was adopted by the Tories across the whole of the UK as a post-study work visa. It was then cancelled, and almost to add insult to injury, special consideration was given to the LSE, to Oxford and to Cambridge to continue to access the benefits that it gave. So until we see some real action from the Conservatives at Westminster on this area, I still remain sceptical about warm worms in the Chamber today. A recent survey of 1,000 staff at the Francis Crick Institute in London, one of the largest biomedical research centres in Europe, revealed that 78% of EU scientists at the centre stated they were less likely to stay in the UK. 51% of all staff at the Institute stated they were less likely to stay in the UK. 45% of lab heads said Brexit had already affected their work, either in recruiting new scientists or being excluded from EU programmes, or facing increased costs after the fall of the pound. And 97% of those who responded said a no-deal Brexit would be bad for UK science. If I could quote Dame Anne Glover, the current chair of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and a former scientific advisor to the EU, in response to that report, she said, "International collaboration and a sustained deep science partnership with the EU is vital in supporting scientific progress and social and economic well-being. A no-deal or a hard Brexit puts this at risk, and I reiterate the call I made earlier this year to the Prime Minister to take all necessary steps to secure an agreement on science and research in the Brexit negotiations, which ensures the closest possible research relationship within the EU. These concerns should not be taken lightly. It is vitally important. A recent House of Commons Science and Technology Committee inquiry entitled Preparations for a No-Deal Brexit in the Context of Science and Innovation was published, and I recommend that everyone in this chamber reads that document. In response, the Royal Society of Edinburgh produced a report response on it, and I want to read from their summary. And I find it almost as if any of these concerns could be applied to any aspect of Brexit. In terms of the uncertainty associated with the outcome of Brexit, they said it would have a deleterious effect on the UK's research endeavours. While the UK government has sought to reassure the science community, it says there is a significant lack of clarity and detail. In terms of Horizon 2020 and not being able to access the mono-beneficiary parts of Horizon 2020, it said there are no firm details on what the contingency arrangements will look like. And in terms of the ongoing costs and the impact on universities, it said it makes it very uncertain and unpredictable territory. They go on to highlight Erasmus and the importance of Erasmus, and it says that there must be the needs of the particular circumstances of devolved nations to be taken account of. So there we have it, serious concerns from the brightest and best brains in our country in the Royal Society of Edinburgh, highlighting the devastating impact this is going to have. Presiding Officer, I convened the Parliament Committee on Education and Skills, and unanimously, and it's one of the committees that does have representations from all the parties here, we wrote to then Ms Patel about our concerns. And they've been highlighted already, but it's worth reiterating. The ETLR, the 3-year visa proposed, will not help Scottish universities. 96.4% of all REU students on undergraduate courses in Scotland expect the length of their study to be greater than 3 years. And a cost between £400 and maybe over £1,000 is not going to be viable to attract EU students going forward. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Jamie Halcrow-Johnson, followed by Sandra White.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I, on behalf of these Conservative benches, welcome Beatrice Wishart to Parliament, and a very thoughtful maiden speech, some of which I agreed with and some of which I didn't. But it is good to have another Islander here in Parliament and somebody else who can work with us to support and to promote the issues that are unique to island communities. The UK has long been known as one of the major international destinations for the world's leading academics and researchers. In Scotland particularly, we've punched well above our weight, not only in the quality of our university and research sector, but in attracting talent and in terms of open collaboration. This is in large part thanks to Scotland's long and well-developed traditions of higher education and the hard work of our institutions in building connections internationally. While leaving the EU is a backdrop of today's debate, this openness, this pull, has never ended at the borders of the European Union. We can look at the universities in our own regions and see some of the bonds that have been built across the globe. In my own part of Scotland, the University of the Highlands and Islands has partnered with institutions as far afield as Japan. This, however, is not to reduce the cross-border cooperation that has taken place with our nearest neighbours in the EU. Successive governments of all stripes have, time and time again, emphasised the importance of the university and research sector in our immigration policy. That must remain the case. There is no shortage of arguments for skilled migration in this sector. University of Scotland have set out evidence of the benefits of mobility of talent to their member institutions. However, it is more than that. There is a wider benefit, that global outlook, the benefits of which may be less tangible, but to many of us are just as clear. The reality is that we exist in a competitive international marketplace, and one with increasing numbers of competitors seeking a position on the global stage. If our universities are to be world-ranking, then quite simply we must attract world-ranking talent. The government benches will be well aware of the work that my colleague Liz Smith has done with them in the past, and from our approach, particularly on post-study work, that common ground can be found. Where reasonable suggestions have been made and have cross-party support, we've been willing to work to persuade the Home Office and others to look into them. In his motion, Richard Lockhead has pointed to the temporary leave to remain policy that was proposed by the UK government. I welcome the positive movement here to make things easier for students from EU countries in the event of a no-deal Brexit. This is the sort of contingency planning that should be taking place, even if we hope that it is never deployed. But I am far from immune to the concerns raised by bodies across the sector on the 3-year limit and the issues caused by 4-year undergraduate honours degrees being the norm at universities here in Scotland. As we'll all be aware, Claire Addison has written to the Home Secretary on this point. The issues she raises are reasonable and well-founded. It's important that, when we prepare, we get things right. In terms of existing university and research staff, it is worth again noting that the EU settlement scheme is now not only a policy, but a reality on the ground. During the period of free movement of labour, thousands of people have made their homes here in the UK and contributed to our country. It is positive that the UK government has recognised this, regardless of the position on withdrawal or the future relationship. We should also consider academic and research collaboration. For many years now, EU institutions have been supportive and helpful in building these links between the member states. There is a legitimate question to any government, particularly one taking us out of the EU without a deal, on what will replace those structures. But again, we can look to examples of where successful collaboration takes place with institutions outside of the EU. It can be an opportunity to examine these links and our own approach globally, and to remember that more can and should be done beyond the EU's borders. An orderly exit from the EU must, of course, respect the political background has changed and recognise that certain structures may no longer exist. There is undoubtedly still work to be done, and I would hope that an agreed transition period, such as that was proposed as part of the withdrawal agreement, can aid that process. There is, Presiding Officer, a common theme here. Many of these issues can be addressed in the short term by an orderly exit from the EU. For those that still arise, an orderly exit with transitional arrangements will provide the space for discussion on the future relationship with the EU, as well as giving government at all levels space to develop policy to adapt to the new political climate. That requires a deal, and to agree a deal, our friends and colleagues in the UK Parliament have to vote for one. I support that, and I hope after the opportunity for some reflection over the summer, the other parties in this chamber will see that need as well. I'm just finishing, I'm afraid. Scotland is an open and welcoming country for people who want to come, to bring their talents and contribute to our society from any part of the world. But what seems to be overlooked in this chamber is that the UK is too. We need only look at our history, as well as the many people in this country who can, in recent generations, trace their past to migration, to see the evidence of that. While a majority of the UK voted to leave the EU, few want to reverse Britain's open approach to skilled migration. Most recognise the need for a fair immigration system. Post-Brexit, that system can be tailored to the particular needs of this country. But that requires the right approach. And ultimately, it is a process that begins with politicians who may have disagreed in the past behind getting a deal and helping to move on from the current stalemate.
Sandra White, followed by Daniel Johnson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and can I also welcome Beatrice Wishart to the Chamber and her very thoughtful speech. Thank you. Presiding officer, as the MSP for Glasgow Kelvin, I really have an incredible privilege, basically having Glasgow University, Glasgow Caledonia University, Strathclyde University, Glasgow City College, and many research sectors in my constituency. It's an enormous privilege to be able to serve them. And I really am seriously concerned about the impact these proposals from Westminster will have on these institutions. But it's not just the institutions I'm concerned about, and I will come back to the institutions after I have mentioned this particular part. But I have concerns about the individuals who work in these institutions, who live here, and are now being left in limbo by mobility restrictions and planned immigration policies. I've met many of them throughout my constituency. There's families there that don't know their future, and people are really hurting. And with the hurt comes anger as well. They're angry at the fact this is happening to them. And whole communities are affected by this. And that includes the many small businesses that are there in these communities who serve the people there. Multicultural and international. And I would have thought in a country, not just in Scotland, but the UK, the country as a whole, these are things we should be embracing and really not trying to destroy. And that's what's going to happen, unfortunately, certainly in certain areas of my constituency where people just don't know if they're going to be here or not. And I think that's something that the Conservatives should be thinking about in that respect. The Presiding Officer, I want to give some quotes from the universities in my constituency in regards to what's happening at the moment in time. First one is Glasgow Caledonia University, and their response to this from Professor Cam Donaldson, who's a Pro-Vice Convener, Pro-Vice Chancellor and Vice Principal in Research at the university, said, mobility of staff and students within the educational and research environment, and that's very important in universities, is a fundamental tenet of our existence, largely because of the benefit it brings in diversity, educational experience, and it's also very, very important in economic and social benefits to Scotland. In the last few weeks alone, these cases have come to my attention. That's the professor's, not mine. Brexit has been explicitly cited in both cases. Leadership of a major EU Horizon 2020 grant application being switched to a colleague in the Netherlands. A member of staff from another EU country deciding to leave us for employment in another EU member state that is not his home state. Additionally, as UK's #1 university for Erasmus project funding, we are extremely worried about the impact of decisions about that programme on the financial position of the university. Glasgow University's response is over 950 of the University of Glasgow staff are non-UK EU nationals. There are also over 3,000 EU students at the University of Glasgow, 13.2% of the total workforce and 21% of the university's academic staff are EU nationals also. Anton Muscatelli, Principal of the University of Glasgow and Chair of the Russell Group, has warned that a no-deal Brexit could cause a talent drain in Scotland's universities and warned of a lack of clarity which would bring the university sector in Scotland if there's a no-deal Brexit. No deal would cause such dislocation and such uncertainty that that flow of talent would come to a halt, and we desperately want to avoid that. There needs to be a very clear message from the UK Government around how European citizens would be welcome into this country. And thirdly, is Strathclyde University in giving evidence to the Migration Advisory Committee. They mentioned the proportion of EEA staff in academic professional roles is currently 20%. Much higher in other subjects. As a result, we have significant concerns about the potential impact on our ability to recruit and retrain staff in this category. In relation to prominence of EE staff in particular areas, our engineering, science and business facilities have the greatest proportion of EEA staff. Smaller proportion in our humanities and social sciences faculty, with particularly high concentration of EU staff within modern languages, physics and engineering disciplines. They've also gone to mention they've experienced some difficulty in the recruitment of individual senior EA staff, indicated to be directly related to uncertainty about the ability of academics working at UK institutions to access EU research funding. And that is a very, very important issue, the research funding. Having visited universities, Glasgow University also, they rely, and it's been said by the Conservatives also, they rely on the EU funding. And that's a very, very important aspect of it. Presiding Officer, I've given you the comments from the 3 universities. I've also spoken to the constituents in my area who are living in limbo at the moment. I really think it's time we had some clear and straight answers as to what is going to happen to the people in the constituencies, but also to the universities also. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Daniel Johnson, followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to begin my remarks by addressing the arguments that have been put forward by the Conservative benches. I'd like to acknowledge the fact that they have attempted a consensual tone. Also acknowledge the fact that they've also attempted to strike a position somewhat different to their English and UK counterparts. But I do have to object to the attempt to try and take the politics out of this, because it's simply not possible. Because the reality is that the focus and the acceleration towards a no-deal Brexit under Boris Johnson is one of the very real reasons why we're having this debate. A point underlined by the fact that the Work and Pension Secretary resigned over the concentration and focus on no deal within the government. But also, I think the argument that somehow a deal is there to be had were it just for the acquiescence of opposition parties is simply nonsense, because Tory MPs have rejected that deal time after time in the House of Commons. And indeed, that lack of agreement within their own party is underlined by the expulsion of 21 MPs just in the recent days. Just in a moment. But finally, and just to underline the point, even if the Westminster Parliament and the Westminster Government wanted to change direction, wanted to change policy, Parliament is simply unable to sit right now because of the proroguing and the highly unconstitutional manoeuvres undertaken by Boris Johnson and his colleagues in government. Indeed, I think never has there a time been where the phrase "take back control" has seemed more like a sick joke than right now. And if Liz Smith would like to make an intervention, I'll take it.
Liz Smith.
I'm grateful to the member for giving way. He's been very critical of what he considers to be our inconsistency. Could he explain whether he thinks that the Labour Party has been consistent in its line about Brexit?
Daniel Johnson.
I would be more than happy to. We have been consistent that whatever is brought forward has to protect jobs, has to protect rights, and has to protect our economy. Indeed, the very issues that we're debating here. Those were the conditions in our 6 test. We've been clear and consistent, and the deal utterly failed all of them. Now, as it comes to higher education, we are already seeing the effects of Brexit with us already, and a number of speakers, I think, have outlined that very clearly. The reality is that research funding has become more problematic because of the realities of Brexit. Recruiting people from other parts of the world has become more difficult because of the fears of Brexit. And that should perhaps be no surprise, because ultimately, knowledge does not respect borders. But in pursuing research, pursuing the acquisition of new knowledge is by definition an international endeavour. And therefore, the fears and concerns created by Brexit is going to be a concern. And indeed, other members have pointed out experiences in their constituencies, and mine is no different. I'm very fortunate to have the University of Edinburgh's King's Buildings in my constituency, and also the Royal Observatory. I've been on a number of visits looking at experiments regarding climate change, looking at wave technologies in the wave tank in the King's Buildings. I'm also very pleased that we have the Higgs Centre for Innovation, which fosters collaboration between business and science and technology research. And the reality is, every time you make one of those visits, you are struck by the international spectrum of people who are taking part in the research. Every time I visit, you meet people from all parts of the world. Indeed, if you look at just the simple research pages of Edinburgh University, as I did as a simple bit of research prior to this debate, you're struck by not just the sheer number of research papers, over 6,000 within a year, but practically every other paper has an international name beside it. Research is an international endeavour. And indeed, the numbers back that up. 2,500 students in Edinburgh University, a quarter of academics, a half of all researchers throughout Scotland are from other parts of the world. And the funding issues are equally of concern. In Edinburgh University alone, there are 91 Horizon 2020 projects. And 10% of all its research funding comes from the EU. This is what's at risk. The very basis and ability for us to carry out research in a world-class and world-leading way is in jeopardy because of the Brexit proposals that we have in front of us. And it's not just research. Indeed, some 63% of some taught postgrad courses are filled by people from other parts of the world. And that's vital income from our universities who struggle with the funding settlement, I have to admit, that comes from the Scottish Government and require that income stream in order to ensure that they can teach all undergraduates. So we must look at the post-study work visa. It is crazy that we take the time, that we extend the invitation for people to come and study in this country, simply to not make it possible for them to continue to work here. We have to look at the 3-year temporary leave to remain. That is simply insufficient and inadequate for our universities. Ultimately, we live in a global world. Success in terms of pursuing knowledge is about bringing barriers down. Because the simple reality is that borders do not solve problems, they create them.
Stuart McMillan, followed by Alison Harris.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I fully support the motion in front of us today by the Scottish Government, and I will be voting for it at 5 p.m. And I do ask the Parliament to speak with one voice tonight on an issue that is of huge economic and social importance to Scotland. I want to touch upon 2 points. First of all, Jamie Halcrow-Johnson, who's left the chamber now, sadly, but Jamie Halcrow-Johnson spoke about Brexit being the backdrop to this debate. It's not the backdrop, it's fundamental to this debate. There is no backdrop at all. This is fundamental to what's actually going on today. And Oliver Mundell, I was pleased that Mr Mundell took my intervention earlier on, but in his response, when he spoke about the withdrawal agreement, Mr Mundell is therefore telling this chamber and telling the population of Scotland that he's happy to put Scotland into an economic disadvantage as compared to Northern Ireland. And I'm very saddened that Mr Mundell thinks that Scotland should have an economic disadvantage as compared to anywhere else across the UK. The Scottish Government motion highlights Scotland's 4-year degrees and also the UK Government's 3-year European temporary leave to remain policy. The UK Government's policy would place Scottish institutions at a disadvantage, which is yet another example of a UK Government whose focus ends at the Scottish border. Even the Scottish Tories recognise this, hence the reason why they've expressed their concern in their amendment. Also, as I've highlighted in this chamber before, I studied in France twice, Germany, and also in Sweden. I studied through an Erasmus Socrates scheme and also obtained funding from the European Social Fund. I know how important an opportunity I've had to actually study elsewhere and meet people from other nations and also learn as I've been doing the journey. The UK leaving with a no-deal guarantees that obstacles will be put in the way which will make our society poorer as a result. Now, under the proposals in the Immigration White Paper, the EU students will require a study visa. This will deter some EU nationals from coming here, and around 9% of all students at Scottish universities are EU domiciled. Around 21% of research and teaching and around 27% of all research-only staff are EU citizens. Now, this debate highlights the contrast between a Scottish Government who are concerned about the 9% of the population, that's the students, versus a UK Government who show no interest at all in the 8% of the population, that's the population of Scotland. Now, Ross Greer and myself, we answered questions from people from St Columbus High School in Gourock earlier on today, and we're both very much in agreement as to how important freedom of movement has been and also is for Scotland. Now, with Scotland's population increasing thanks mainly to EU immigration, the UK Government's proposals are very much a retrograde step. My community in Inverclyde already has population decline. We are holding up every other local authority across the country. Now, I don't say that with any pride, and I do accept that we've got many challenges. I also accept that we do not have a university in my constituency, but we do have an international population and also scientists who live locally. Now, leaving the EU, whether it's with a deal or no deal, is in effect raising the portcullis to stop people from entering. Now, who would have thought a UK government would do such a thing? Now, presiding officer, the Fresh Talent Initiative, which obviously was introduced by the Labour Liberal Democrat executive, was a positive intervention that all parties across this chamber support, and that very much, I would suggest, is telling. We need to have a fresh talent too, and a tailored immigration system with devolved powers within a UK framework to allow us to set visa rules and also criteria to meet our needs. Now, the Tory amendment wants us to support the efforts to secure a deal. Now, with a UK government in meltdown, with a UK government shutting down the so-called mother of all parliaments, and with a UK government losing government members hand over fist, and also Amber Rudd's claim at the weekend that the Prime Minister's actions are actually aimed at a no-deal exit, then how can we trust a word that the UK government say? Now, with the Commons shut down for 5 weeks, closing down debate and also discussion, then the Prime Minister now has got plenty of time in his hands. Now, I urge the Scottish Tories, I genuinely urge them to highlight the concerns raised in this Parliament to the Prime Minister, which is actually, this Parliament's getting on with the day job, unlike the Prime Minister, who's shirking his responsibilities. Now, in conclusion, Prime Minister, Presiding Officer, I'm sorry for the insult, Presiding Officer. Now, in conclusion, London's Parliament's chaos is having a detrimental effect on Scotland now, and this will continue. Now, Catherine Hammonds, the renowned Professor of Astrophysics at the University of Edinburgh, has indicated that she is shifting the majority of her research activities to Bonn University. She's doing this because of A, Brexit, B, 90% of research funding is by the EU, and C, she doesn't believe that this funding will be replaced if she remained in the UK. Now, Presiding Officer, Brexit, deal or no deal, it will be a disaster. It will be a disaster for our world-class university and scientific research sectors. But also, it will be a disaster for Scotland's economy and also our social fabric. And I urge the Scottish Tories to actually do something right for a change. Actually stand up for Scotland. Stand up for the science and research sectors in Scotland. Because you know what? Your constituents will actually thank you for doing so. Thank you very much.
Alison Harris, followed by Claire Baker.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm grateful to be speaking in today's debate about the future of our university and scientific research sectors. The importance of higher education and scientific research here in Scotland and throughout the UK is unquestioned. For the centuries that our education institutions have existed, one thing that has not changed is the vast range of fantastic talent that passes through their doors. And it's not just world-famous scientists, philosophers or economists who thrive in these sectors. For many of the children growing up in Scotland, going to university is a goal that can fuel aspirations and have an unmistakable impact on their future. Today's motion explicitly mentions the effect of immigration on both the education and scientific research in Scotland. With population growth typically quite low, it goes without saying that the uncertainty of the current situation within the UK poses a concern. However, there are other determinants of population growth besides immigration to the UK, and it would be simplistic to blame changes in migration patterns on Brexit alone. The United Kingdom is proud of its universities and colleges, and rightly so. We have such a strong portfolio of academic success, and I must mention the fantastic modern Forth Valley College in my region of central Scotland. However, I think it would be remiss of me to speak in a debate about the future of higher education sector without mentioning several of the problems it currently faces. Since the SNP came to power, the number of Scottish students going to Scottish universities and colleges has fallen over the last year. The numbers have decreased by over 1,000. Unbelievably, we keep hearing of straight A students being denied entry into Scottish universities. This seriously is just not right. It must be truly heartbreaking for a child who has studied hard to achieve top marks in their Highers and succeeded in achieving their desired results to ultimately be told that this wasn't good enough to achieve their goal of going to a university in Scotland. The SNP's current cap on student places means that Scottish students can only access if you mind, I'm just going to make some progress, please, at the moment. The current cap on student places means that Scottish students can only access half the number of courses at Scottish universities as those pupils south of the border. These problems existed before Brexit and will continue to exist if nothing is done. Now I'm going to make progress, please. When I saw that the motion also referred to the scientific research sector, I recalled a recent visit to a research and manufacturing company based in my region. They are looking into fabulous innovation in new cancer treatments, and I was left and still remain completely in awe of the work they are currently undertaking. Their vital research has the potential to transform lives and hopefully cure some of the more serious illnesses that exist in today's world. The UK needs to remain a world leader in international research. We have a real opportunity to develop homegrown scientific research talent here in Scotland and indeed throughout the UK. Unfortunately, though, the number of candidates pursuing STEM qualifications in Scotland's schools has dropped over the past 5 years. Alongside this, there has been a narrowing of subject choice for children entering S4, meaning it grows less and less likely that future generations will have prolonged experience of STEM subjects as they go into further education and on to work. Realistically, this can only really translate into one thing: fewer young people going into the sciences. We need to be focusing and capitalising on the opportunities available for Scotland's children. Our children are literally the future of the scientific research sector here in Scotland, and they are being let down by this education system. But I'm not going to stand here and pretend that there aren't concerns for those currently working in the scientific research sector at present. There are funding and investment issues, and the recruitment and retention of staff has also become an issue. These issues are real, and Brexit is a reality. As my colleague Oliver Mundell pointed out, the SNP's MPs voted against the UK withdrawal agreement 3 times. So this situation in which we find ourselves, in reality, could have been moved on by now. No, I'm sorry, I'm going to continue. We need to get ourselves out of Groundhog Day instead of keeping going round in circles. I'm not alone in this thinking. Most people that I speak to, whether it be in the streets, in shops, or indeed in the local petrol station, are really looking for all parties to basically grow up. Start resolving our problems, and people are looking for us all to come together in a sensible debate instead of the blame culture that is widely used across this Parliament. Like I said during my speech, this is the future of our children, and we simply cannot continue to let these children down. It's easy to lose sight of the reality of the situation, and it's vital that we remain focused on the current issues facing these sectors. Thank you.
Claire Baker, followed by Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome this afternoon's debate. Scotland has a strong university and scientific research sector which has grown in significance in recent decades. We have high international ratings, and the sector contributes significantly to our economy and the vitality and creativity of our country. In my own region of Mid-Scotland and Fife, I am proud to have St Andrews University, Stirling University and the University of Highlands and Islands at Perth College. These institutions bring huge value to the region. They bring students and staff from around the world to work and study, bring cultural diversity to the region, and help encourage talented individuals with the skills that we need to decide to settle in my region and contribute to its future. We face a skills shortage in key areas in science and roles which are critical to the provision of health care and education. Mobility is important to meeting these demands, and maintaining opportunities for people to study and start their careers here helps us to be an attractive destination for skilled and talented professionals. The exchange of talent is important, and the benefits last beyond graduation. There is evidence to show that international graduates are more likely to do business with the UK as a result of studying here, and a high proportion plan to build professional links with organisations in the UK. The process of leaving the European Union is complicated, divisive and very uncertain. Recent weeks have seen the prospect of no deal become the pursuit of some in government, and attempts by opposition parties and former members of the government try to prevent this outcome. We now have Parliament suspended for an unreasonable length of time and a time of great uncertainty, when accountability should be enhanced, not being avoided. However, for today's debate, we need to pause. If we stand back from the immediate situation, which is difficult to do because it's so pressing and significant to everything else that happens after it is resolved, we can perhaps this afternoon agree some principles and solutions to what the landscape needs to look like for the university and research sector if the UK is no longer a member of the EU. The motion raises a number of issues that must be addressed if the needs of Scottish institutions are going to be met. In my committee work, we have heard about the lack of understanding of devolution among UK government departments. There's a feeling that the enthusiasm and knowledge of the early days of devolution has dissipated, and that the civil service has fewer members who have a working knowledge of the Scottish Parliament. The announcement of the European temporary leave to remain, that is to be 3 years to meet the needs of an undergraduate degree, indicates that there is an ignorance of the Scottish university sector. It is disappointing that following clear evidence from the sector, pressure from Scottish MPs and correspondence from the Scottish Parliament's Education and Skills Committee, there has been no indication of a change in policy from the UK Government. It is not acceptable for students in Scotland to be disadvantaged by having to pay a significant fee to convert to a Tier 4 international student visa in their final years. As a member of the European Committee, I have also taken evidence on the future of the Erasmus scheme, the benefits of which University Scotland have outlined in their briefing for us today. Over 2,500 people at Scottish universities did a study or work exchange through Erasmus in 2016-17. The committee also heard about the amount of college students and staff who benefit from the scheme and the extent to which Scotland benefits, receiving a larger share than its population. There were still question marks over the future direction of the scheme, but there was a degree of security until 2020 and an indication of a willingness to continue in this or a similar model, although there were no guarantees. Now the prospect of a no deal disrupts this, and the UK could leave by default, and exchanges would then only be possible through bilateral agreements with potentially complicated visa systems. If it survived as a model of exchange, it would likely become limited to the more resourced and internationally connected institutions, limiting access and opportunity for the breadth of student and staff it currently serves. We are set to lose a lot by leaving the EU, but we must not lose sight of the value of international education exchanges and work to continue a scheme which offers broad opportunities. The UK leaving the EU means a change to the immigration system. To imagine what this might look like, we currently have the White Paper, which has been broadly criticised for failing to recognise the needs of our economy and the role that migration plays in Scotland. We face a demographic challenge in Scotland, one which at the moment is perhaps similar to parts of England, but in coming years we are predicted to become more difficult, and it will lead to labour shortages in key public services as well as in the private sector. The solutions in the proposed White Paper do not offer a sustainable solution for Scotland. I believe that in the event of leaving the EU, the UK needs to have a coherent immigration policy across the whole of the UK to avoid the need for any kind of border checks and restrictions on movement for UK citizens. However, within that future model, it should be possible to have flexibility and tailored policies which mean particular needs, whether those are sectoral or geographical, can be met. The Fresh Talent Scheme, which operated in Scotland between 2005 and 2008, before a model was adopted across the UK, is an example of a divergent policy. My understanding is that it wasn't easy to craft that scheme between two governments, but a solution was found and the scheme was successful. This post-study work visa provided opportunities for students to successfully study in Scotland and opportunities for our businesses and society to take advantage of their education. I was the Labour representative on the cross-party group that was led by the then Minister Humza Yousaf, and across the Parliament we put a strong case based on fact and reason to argue for a return of the scheme. Those arguments and the cross-party consensus that was achieved still stands, and this approach should be the direction of a UK government which wishes to represent the whole of the UK, and it should adopt this. The Scottish Government have set out ambitions in Scotland's population needs and migration policy, and I'll soon be meeting with the Minister to discuss these proposals. But we all need to do more than wish a workable solution into being, and the Scottish Government has the greater resources to do so. I accept that the current UK Government is intransigent, but they might not be there for much longer. Migration will be a key issue in future years, and we need a solution that works for all our society and our economy. Thank you.
Gillian Martin, followed by Sorry, I was getting your name wrong there. I do want to insist on calling you something else for some reason. Oh, that sounded very bad. Apologies for that. Alexander, followed by Alexander Stewart. Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think this is the fourth debate that I've been involved in on the potential detrimental effects of UK government post-Brexit policies on Scottish universities. Hard or soft Brexit, deal or no deal, it's the potential damage of short-sighted and ill-thought-out immigration policies which has been a common thread throughout my speeches in all four debates. And I want to make it clear that I don't think the UK government has to have a secure deal with the EU in order to make sensible immigration proposals. And ahead of this debate, I looked into the salary scales of academic support staff and academic staff at the University of Aberdeen for reference, as we look at the current proposals for salary thresholds for work visa eligibility, as mooted by this month's Home Office Minister, Priti Patel. As we speak, the proposed threshold is 30,000, which is already below the UK median annual salary of 28,600. But we also know that Ian Duncan Smith and the rather badly named Centre of Social Justice recommends a threshold of 36,000, in line with the threshold for other foreign nationals outside the EU. And I hope that Priti Patel has ruled this increase out, but I can't find any record of her doing so, and I have looked. The White Paper doesn't confirm a level of future salary, so that's a source of great worry to a great many people. Now, research support staff at the University of Aberdeen start around about 17,000 a year in line with living wage requirements, and at the highest grade their salaries come in at £29,176 a year. The majority of support staff are in the early 20 to mid-20 bracket. And by support staff, I mean lab managers, research assistants and lab technicians. And they're highly trained and highly qualified specialists involved in the very core facilities, without whom no vital research would get done. Now, currently, all those posts would fall below the salary threshold proposed by the UK government post-Brexit. And we also know that around a third of those support staff are from outside the UK, vast majority being from other EU countries. And moving on to the academic positions within Aberdeen University, postdoctoral research fellows could expect to have a salary of around about 32,000, but many academics at entry level in that year between handing in their PhD and their award are on a salary of around 28,000. Now, with that proposed salary threshold of 36,000, we'd lose postdoctoral fellows from other EU countries. And even with the threshold of 30,000, we could be looking at having that gap removed of that coming from a PhD moving into the fellow position. I mean, what are they going to do? Are they just going to come home, go home and never come back to Scotland? And let's not forget colleges. The starting salary of a college lecturer is also well under the £30,000 threshold. So colleges could lose a great many of future staff. We know that 30% of UK academic staff are made up of non-UK foreign-born citizens. And the university staff who come to work here from outside the UK would currently not qualify for a work visa as currently proposed by the Home Office. And that talent drain will have a lasting and direct detrimental effect on Scottish students and our international students alike. And that's what the crux of my intervention on the Minister there. What is the effect going to be on our students? And I wholeheartedly agree with the points made in the publication of the Russell Group, represent 24 UK universities, including University of Glasgow and Edinburgh. They have said that a salary threshold should not go higher than 21,000. They've also asked for part-time and flexible work to be taken into account and a pro rata calculation to form part of the conditions. And if this is not done by the Home Office, they're further disadvantaging those with caring responsibilities and in practice excluding many female workers. And I also agree that the Tier 1 exceptional talent visa scheme should be expanded to allow people of talent from all levels. Salary should not be the main criteria. Presiding Officer, I want to end today by once again highlighting the self-harm of the scrapping of the post-study work visa. Not only must the European temporary leave to remain policy take into account the duration of Scottish degrees, so many people have mentioned that here, we should be doing what we can to encourage our graduates from EU countries to give us the economic and social benefit of their talent by offering them a post-study work visa. Let's not forget that this visa was taken away from our graduates, and we can only guess at the economic deficits already caused over the past 7 years since it was scrapped. Scotland's universities are already dealing with a huge amount of uncertainty over the loss of EU funding, and they're already seeing teaching and research vacancies going unfilled as talent from other EU countries rejects the prospect of an unwelcoming UK. And the UK government is the source of all of that. With their right-wing appeasing immigration policy, they are making matters 10 times worse. It's high time we had control over immigration in Scotland.
Mr Alexander Stewart, to be followed by Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I answer to many things, as you know, but in the chamber I'll have my full Sunday name, so thank you so much. I welcome the opportunity to take part in today's debate on this important issue of the UK Government's planned immigration policy and mobility restrictions in Scotland's universities and scientific research centres. As my colleagues have highlighted, the Scottish Conservatives have always taken a slightly different view on matters on our UK counterparts. And I pay tribute to Liz Smith, who has fought tirelessly on this subject. And we have consistently supported the introduction of a new post-study work visa, because we believe that that in itself should be retained. Whilst accepting that there were flaws with the previous system, which allowed for too many loopholes, we believe that a more flexible system is possible. And I would like to think that we could do that from both increasing the university sector and the wider Scottish economy. Whilst we may take a somewhat different view from our Westminster colleagues on this issue, the situation is currently indicating that we do not want a differentiated immigration system here in Scotland. The CBI, the Food and Drink Federation, the Scottish Chambers of Commerce and NFU Scotland have all spoken out against that differentiation. And it's clear that a distinct immigration system would simply not work, and that may add to, not at the moment, I'd like to make some progress. And it is important to us all to remember that the Scottish Government's record when it comes to universities, Presiding Officer, the SNP administration have cut funding on each and every university. And in my own region of Mid-Scotland and Fife, I have St Andrews University, I have Stirling University, I have Perth College, which is part of the Highlands Islands University, and I have Forth Valley. And each and every one of those institutions have indicated that they are struggling financially for that position. And that is a fact that none of us can deny. It is the case that there has been a reduction of nearly 400 million in the last 5 years, and that's around 130 million in real terms. University Scotland themselves has estimated that the Scottish university budget will contract by a further 1.8% in the following year. The record of that is showing that it's vital, and we cannot accept that everything in the garden is rosy. We've heard that today. We acknowledge the fact that there are difficulties, Presiding Officer, but the facts speak for themselves, and when the institutions tell us what's taking place, that is very much the case. On the other hand, the UK Government has shown the commitment to the university sector by guaranteeing Horizon 2020 research funding, even if the UK leave the EU without a deal. Now, I don't want that to be the case. None of us want that to be the case, that we leave without a deal. We need to secure a deal, because by securing a deal, that will help support our universities and our research facilities, and that's vitally important. The UK Government has also committed to converting and covering the cost of the Erasmus Plus and the European Solidarity Corps until the end of 2020. It's maybe only 2020, but at least it's secured for that timescale, and it's important that we work together to ensure that we continue with that funding. Happy to take.
Richard Lochhead.
Can I thank the member for giving way? In light of the suggested financial challenges facing the higher education sector the member referred to, can he explain how Brexit will help the universities address those financial challenges?
Alexander Stewart.
As I've already said, we need to work together to try and manage this process. Brexit is happening, Minister. The United Kingdom made that decision, and we need to honour that decision. And I want to work collaboratively to ensure that we have that working for us, because Brexit is here and we need to ensure that the universities and research centres receive that funding. I accept that the EU research funding is indeed important, but also we must not forget that in the UK itself, we are 6 times more funding comes from the UK than it does come from the EU. And that in itself is vitally important. And we have the structure like the Scottish Funding Council. These are opportunities for us to continue to work with our European neighbours and partners on a case-by-case basis where it is benefiting to us all. Collaboration is vitally important, Presiding Officer, and that has been proved many, many times before. Schemes like Erasmus Plus can be transformational for those individuals who take part. We've already heard that. We already know that. Individuals and organisations tell us that. But it is vitally important that the EU, that we work with our members out with the EU, as well as the 28 members that we have. I was at university in Stirling yesterday when we were talking about city deals, and there are in excess of 100 different nationalities and countries at that university, all supporting and going forward. The current political declaration that has been agreed between the UK and the EU states that the UK could continue to participate in such schemes if there was a fair and appropriate financial contribution. And I believe that is only right and proper. But we also must look at the record of the SNP. My colleague Alison Harrison has talked about the number of students in Scotland University that has decreased by over 1,000 in the last year alone. That's about 4%. And that's totally unacceptable in the circumstances. The cap on students facing further disadvantages in Scotland when it comes to UCAS clearing has been shown. And we talk about the difficulties and the comparisons south of the border. It is important, Presiding Officer, that we respect the referendum result and we leave the European Union. We all want to have a managed exit and a deal. What's important is a deal, while we will see. But we have had opportunities in the past when individuals have progressed the no-deal situation to cause some disriot and to cause some situations across. So working together with our colleagues in the UK government, we can secure that students in Scotland can have a thriving research sector, and we can see that prosper for us all, because that's exactly what we want. Working together, we can achieve so much more. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
The last of the open debate contributions is from Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I didn't have the opportunity to go to university. Instead, I entered into the world of work early. But I pledged to myself that my 2 children would not be the same, and they would have the chance to go to university, and they did. Both made my wife and I very proud. I did that because I believe that the opportunity to learn is of the utmost importance, and we should work to make it a reality for all. In Scotland, we are a home to some of the most highly rated research institutions in the world. Indeed, some of the best students in Europe actively choose to study and work in Scotland, and EU researchers are driving forward their science and innovation. We rightly have an international outlook which makes us proud to be a destination of choice for students and academics the world over. All of this is threatened by Brexit and the related hostile immigration policies of the UK government, policies which should not be allowed to stymie Scotland's scientific and economic progress. Presiding Officer, for me, issues like immigration are not just political, they are personal. My mother-in-law was Dutch. My father-in-law was Lithuanian. The ability to live, learn, love without barriers is of the utmost importance. If they had not come to Scotland, I would not have met my wife, I would not have had any children, I wouldn't have my glorious grandchildren. It makes you think, doesn't it? Under the current UK government proposals in the Immigration White Paper, EU students will require a study visa, placing an additional burden on both students and universities, and potentially deter EU nationals from coming here. Indeed, the perfect illustration of just how little the UK government knows or cares about Scotland, its proposed temporary leave to remain scheme would fall short of covering students studying for a 4-year degree in Scotland. It truly beggars belief. To suggest that EU students will have to apply for a visa for a further year at a cost of up to £840 is an outrage and must be dropped. Scotland absolutely must have a tailored migration system for Scotland, with devolved powers with the UK framework to allow us to set visa rules and criteria to meet Scotland's most acute needs. And frankly, moving EEA nationals onto a visa system could act as a barrier to skilled researchers wishing to work in Scotland. I never tire, Presiding Officer, of saying that Scotland did not vote for Brexit, and the Scottish Government believes it will be damaging for our economy, our communities and our reputation. It's not just for me that is saying this. The higher education sector in Scotland also has concerns regarding leaving the EU. Become more difficult through a loss of freedom of movement to attract and retain EU staff and students. We will lose access to significant research funding and collaboration, such as Horizon 2020, as well as participation in the wide range of EU programmes, including Erasmus. Scotland has long been an attractive destination for international students from within and beyond the UK. But UK student visa policies and the threat of Brexit is sending a negative message to students considering Scotland for their studies. It's therefore important that we continue to reiterate our view. Not only did we not vote for Brexit, but that to anyone thinking of coming to Scotland to study or indeed to work in our institutions, you are most welcome here. Presiding Officer, the UK Government does not have a credible plan. Where is the plan? Show me the plan. You don't have a plan to ensure that our valuable science and research can be maintained and enhanced following Brexit. In fairness, the UK Government at present doesn't even have a credible plan, as I've said, other than to shut down Westminster. Watching that yesterday was an absolute disgrace. Avoid scrutiny, pursue a no-deal Brexit. This appears to be their reality, not ours. That sits in stark contrast to the Scottish Government, whom is the only administration in the UK which has a consistent plan since 2016 to resolve these issues. Staying in the European single market, the custom union, is the only solution, short of remaining a full EU member, which would break the current impasse which has brought us to the brink of a no-deal Brexit. The set out Scotland's place in Europe Science Research, published in November 2018, Scotland has much to offer the world when it comes to science and research. Scottish Government, I believe, will do everything it can to continue to bolster our economic strengths through its existing valuable partnerships and new collaborations across Europe and beyond. Scotland is a proud European nation, and we will continue to be so. Presiding Officer, it's time for this Prime Minister to heed the warnings raised by some of the UK and Europe's leading names in science and research, and have an urgent wake-up call from a letter which was sent to Theresa May and Jean-Claude Juncker, where 29 Nobel laureates said that freedom of movement and funding were two of the sector's biggest concerns, including Sir Paul Nurse, one of the signatories of the letter, who stated that a hard Brexit outcome would cripple UK science and government needs to sit up and listen. Not only is it time that this Prime Minister had a wake-up call, it's time him, his government and his members, both in this Parliament and, sadly, not sitting in the other Parliament, I call it the English Parliament, stop playing dictatorial policies and realise that these people's lives that they're playing with, and here in this chamber, and indeed across Scotland, are done with their games. Scotland needs a different path, a path that doesn't end with Brexit Britain.
We now move to the closing speeches, and I call Alex Rowley for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We've certainly had an interesting discussion and debate today. Can I begin on behalf of Labour in congratulating Beatrice Wishart on her first speech in this Parliament and congratulate her on her by-election win. I didn't get up to Shetland for the campaign, but my brother lived on Bressie for many, many years, so I'm a regular to Shetland, and I wish you every success in standing up and fighting for the people of Shetland and Scotland. An interesting debate in many ways, because I have to say that it strikes me that the Scottish Conservative and Brexit Party are completely confused over where we are, or in complete denial of where we are in terms of Brexit. Because I have watched, as I'm sure many have, since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, and it is evidently clear that he is not seeking a deal to get us out of the EU. Indeed, when he was in Ireland yesterday, the Taoiseach was making the point that the backstop is not up for negotiations unless a credible alternative can be brought forward. And there has been a complete failure on the part of Boris Johnson to bring any credible alternative forward. And that was backed up when the Home Secretary announced her resignation and made the point that there is no effort going into Brexit. So even within, or certainly not to find a deal for Brexit, there's a lot of effort going in to a no-deal Brexit. So I would say that there is a sense of denial by the Scottish Conservative and Brexit Party that really we need to wake up to. I also take the point that Gillian Martin makes that this is the fourth debate, I think Gillian said, on these issues. And I accept that, and John Swinney made the point earlier, that Liz Smith has worked quite hard, and Alexander Stewart made the point that you take a different opinion on some of these issues. But taking a different opinion hasn't actually achieved anything. And despite all the efforts of Liz Smith, it hasn't actually achieved anything in terms of looking at particularly the European temporary leave to remain legislation, which is so bad for Scotland. And the National Union of Students, in a briefing that they sent round, they say with urgency, we implore the UK government to deviate from their current European temporary leave to remain policy, which actively discriminates against EU students wishing to study in Scotland, whilst placing Scottish institutions at a competitive disadvantage in attracting students from across the continent. So it's fine for us to have had 4 debates in here, and it's fine for the Scottish Conservative and Brexit Party to say they're different on this issue, but the reality is nobody down there in the UK Parliament is actually, and the Conservative Party is actually listening to you. The National Union of Students go on to say there should be an immediate revision of the European temporary leave to remain extend the student visa for the duration of their studies, no matter what this may be, with specific allowances for student disadvantage and welfare. Further, the UK government should reintroduce a post-study work visa, allowing students to study in Scotland, to work, live and further contribute to Scotland after their studies, a point that was made by Claire Adamson and Claire Baker when they talked about the Fresh Talent Initiative, which was successful for Scotland. And then comes a Tory government. So there's virtually a refusal by the Tories to actually recognise that we are different in Scotland. Our degree system is different in Scotland. And just a complete refusal to acknowledge that. So the Conservative and Brexit Party, I think, need to wake up to the realities of where we're at. I was also struck by the point that Sandra White made when she said this is about people and people in her constituency, because the University of Scotland say that amongst our staff we have 6,500 EU nationals, 13.4%, and 4,275 non-EU international citizens working across the teaching, research and other professional roles, finance, marketing and welfare. Non-UK nationals tend to be found more commonly in teaching or in research roles in universities. Combined EU and non-EU international staff make up 47% of university staff who focus on research only, and 29% of staff who do both teaching and research. Given those numbers, and given the point that Sandra White makes, these are real people, you can see the concerns and the worry that's being caused for those individuals and for their families. Not to mention, as the Minister did, the effect that will have on us losing much of the academic staff, or with the potential to lose academic staff, who will go elsewhere in Europe. And I think it's important that we also remember the net economic impact to Scotland of international students entering higher education. In 2015-16, the figure for that was worth £1.9 million to Scotland, £1.9 billion to Scotland. So no small number there in terms of our economy. Looking specifically at living costs, international students spend in Scotland, and again using the 15-16 figures, it is estimated to have been £517.5 million. So again, in terms of the Scottish economy, this is very, very crucial and important. University of Scotland estimates
Mr. Rowley, could you begin to wind up, please?
Yeah, the tourism spend for students and family and friends is £25.7 million. If this is the fourth debate we've had, it's time that the Tories in Westminster were listening. Sadly, I'm not sure they are.
Thank you. I call Liz Smith to be followed by Ben McPherson. Liz Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And before I address the comments across the Chamber, can I add my congratulations to Beatrice Wishart on what I thought was an excellent maiden speech. May I express some personal views in this policy area? This Parliament knows that I have for several years been a critic of aspects of the UK Government's immigration policy, most especially that which relates to post-study work visas for postgraduates. I did not agree with the removal of the post-study work visa in 2012, not least because of what I believe would be the detrimental impact on universities in Scotland, which is exactly why I chose to participate in the Scottish Government's post-study work steering group in 2016 that Claire Baker mentioned. And can I commend again to the Parliament the cross-party findings of that report and its recommendations. This Parliament knows too that I voted Remain. One of the key reasons behind my decision was listening to views of many in the higher education sector, and I continue to do so. But I'd like to put all this in the proper context. Let us firstly remember exactly why there was concern about the visa system back in 2012. That was because within the preceding 4 years, there had been considerable abuse of the system. It was first identified with the bogus college issue, which became very relevant to Scotland thanks to the Herald newspaper investigation in 2008, which exposed malpractice in 3 Scottish colleges, the then Glasgow College, Middlesex College and the LSMT Business School. The investigation resulted in each being struck off the register, and rightly so. These operations in Scotland were bad enough, but the problem was even worse in England. It turned out that there were many unlicensed institutions operating out with the law, and in some cases acting as a front for illegal immigrants. That was clearly unacceptable, and quite rightly led to moves by the UK Government and by the Scottish Government to protect the term college and to tighten up on student movement. The second context is the increasing pressure on university places across the whole of the UK, which has increased the competition within student application processes. That's a welcome development in many respects, but it has brought with it new challenges, which is why the universities themselves have sought tighter Home Office guidance and clarity about the visa process. The third context is, of course, Brexit. And whilst those of us who voted Remain continue to regret the outcome of that 2016 referendum, it is incumbent upon all of us to accept the result and move on. But let me turn now to why we need to get this issue sorted, and why I have continued to lobby hard the Westminster Government to make changes. And I remain very hopeful indeed, that in the coming days there will be some progress, albeit that it has taken far too long to get to this point. The current system is not satisfactory because it does undermine the ability of higher education institutions to attract and retain staff and students in the way that meets the needs of their academic programmes, particularly in a fast-changing international climate where there is such intense competition between our universities. When I was told by one of our medical schools that a cutting-edge knowledge exchange research programme had been temporarily halted because some of the researchers from the Far East had had to return home, and when their visa ran out, I recognised just how damaging a restrictive visa system could be. Likewise, we've also heard of situations where the Scottish lead in a knowledge exchange project has been put into doubt because of concerns about visa continuity. That, Presiding Officer, cannot be right. Our universities should not be put in a situation where they are forced to worry about the future of a key research project, one which not only has high educational value, but extensive economic benefit, and that is why change is so desperately needed. The latest University Scotland briefing shows that the percentage share of EU students at our universities is 8.7% and 13% for international students, pulling in somewhere in the region of 1.9 billion to the Scottish economy. For university staff, the statistics are 13.4% and 8.8% respectively. And that's just one of the reasons why Scottish universities have, over recent years, been able to punch well above their weight when it comes to attracting research funding. The international mathematical models show the greatest creative success within higher education comes when there is a high level of qualitative collaboration between different countries, and that in turn depends on relatively free movement of students and staff, and a visa system which is not unnecessarily restrictive. And may I comment also on the Erasmus project, which in my role as convener of the cross-party group on colleges and universities I have been very anxious to promote. Established in 1987, its exchange purpose for EU students has been extraordinarily successful, not just because of the 9 million people that participated in it since its inception, but because of the quality of the work and the undoubted benefits of opening up exchange opportunities for those who might otherwise not have that opportunity. Presiding Officer, I believe that this policy area is absolutely fundamental, not only to our higher education institutions, but to the future of the economy in Scotland. We are incredibly lucky in this country to have 19 outstanding institutions in the higher education sector. So far, our Westminster government has not lived up to its reputation of being able to protect that sector in the way that we want. I repeat my comments that I am very hopeful that in the coming days we will see a change. That change is long overdue, but it's much needed, and I very much hope that it will make some considerable changes to the way that our universities can operate in the days ahead.
Thank you very much. And I call on Ben McPherson to conclude this debate for us.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you to all members for contributions today in what I believe is a very important debate, and particularly congratulations to Beatrice Wishart on a very thoughtful contribution and one that I will refer to again shortly. Presiding Officer, we live in serious times, and in serious times it's important that we're able to debate important issues. It is shocking that the Westminster Parliament has been prorogued, and while Westminster has been silent, we in this place must collaborate on what we share concerns about and on the issues that confront us. And what has been clear from today's debate is, one, across the chamber, we share a respect and admiration for the huge contribution that the higher and further education sector makes to Scotland's economy and to Scottish society and to our international reputation. There seems general consensus, secondly, that both Brexit combined with proposed UK government immigration policy is having a negative impact on the higher education and further education sectors and is an issue of widespread and real concern. Thirdly, there seems to be consensus that the proposed UK government policy position in a no-deal scenario of a 3-year European temporary leave to remain solution is not a solution with a 3-year limit, and that the UK government urgently needs to look at this issue. I had an undertaking from the previous Minister of Immigration that she would look at this urgently, and yet in recent weeks we have received no correspondence to any minister in the Scottish Government on the situation with this position. This needs to be changed because it is discriminatory, as the motion says, against Scottish higher education institutions, as well as other students studying longer degrees, and we need action to sort this. It should never have happened in the first place, and we need action to sort it. I talked about shared concerns, and one of the concerns that seemed some in the Tory benches didn't accept this, but most across the chamber did, that the end of freedom of movement in itself will have a negative impact on Scotland's further and higher education sectors. First of all, the emotional but also practical implications that it is having on those who have been here for some time, working in our sectors. And that is why the Scottish Government is committed to our Stay in Scotland campaign, and I would make an appeal that all members continue to engage in that campaign so that in the further and higher education sectors and all across Scotland, collectively, we're doing all that we can to commit that welcoming message, to emphasise that welcoming message and to support people to stay. But also, there's an important point about attractiveness. And the Cabinet Secretary and Deputy First Minister made this point really well, as did Ian Gray in the debate. The fact that Brexit in itself, combined with UK Government immigration policy proposals, including a salary threshold of £30,000, an immigration skills charge and added bureaucracy, are all contributing to a less attractive environment for people to come here to study and work. And we need not just action on the examples within the motion, but also action on UK Government immigration policy as a whole. Because if what is being proposed is taken forward by the UK Government, and the challenges, whether it be the cost of a Tier 4 student visa and added challenges around being able to remain after study, being applied to EAA and Swiss students, if all of that is taken forward by the UK Government, then it will just be an even more unattractive place for people to come and people to stay. So we need change. Presiding Officer, we value all skills in the Scottish Government, and that, of course, includes those who are graduates. And that is why the Scottish Government has, for a long time, argued for the return of the post-study work visa, and for students studying all degrees at bachelor and above levels, and for them to be able to remain here in the UK, in Scotland, for 2 years after graduating. And as outlined today in the motion, such a route would be a vital lever for attracting the best international student talent, securing essential income streams and allowing gifted graduates, people of skill and intellect and commitment, to continue contributing to Scotland after their studies. And whilst no substitute will give the same benefit as freedom of movement, we need the UK Government to collaborate and commit to solutions in this sphere, solutions that can keep graduates here in Scotland, but also innovative solutions in terms of Scottish and UK immigration policy as a whole. And we could deliver a post-study work visa in 2 ways. One, the UK Government could recommit to the introduction of a post-study work visa, and we call for that in the motion. We call for it today, we've called for it for 2 years, and we continue to call for it, and we want to see it happen. But two, we could also deliver such a solution through tailored immigration policies within a UK framework. And Alexander Stewart was very dismissive of the potential for tailored immigration solutions for Scotland. But I just quote to him the SCDI, that other countries successfully operate regional migration schemes which target the specific needs of their economies, and SCDI believes that there are workable options for more differentiation within the UK system. So business is listening, business is open-minded, and it's time for the Scottish Conservatives to be open-minded about solutions for Scotland. We also could be flexible and innovative with such tailored solutions in terms of how we tackle challenges in rural and island communities and incentivise. So I would encourage Beatrix Wishart, as the newest member of the Liberal Democrats, for the Scottish Liberal Democrats to engage with the Scottish Government on the potential for tailored migration policies for Scotland, and my door is absolutely open to having those conversations. So we could do it in 2 ways. in terms of delivering solutions to keep people here after their studies. And we want to see a reintroduction of the post-study work visa, and we also want to see open-mindedness and engagement on tailored migration solutions for Scotland. Presiding Officer, let me, first of all, before I conclude, just deal with the Tory amendment and why we will not be supporting it today. The Tory amendment takes out the statement that the proposed UK immigration policies would be deeply damaging to Scotland's further education sectors and higher education and research sectors. All the evidence in the debate today suggests that that would be the case, so we can't accept that. And also, the UK government, the Scottish Conservative Amendment suggests that calls on all parties to support the UK government's efforts to bring an outcome and a deal in the Brexit scenario. I would be enlightened to know what those efforts are, given that Amber Rudd has said that there's such little effort going into achieving solutions. And of course, there was much reference from the Conservatives that criticising the SNP's stance in Westminster on Brexit. I would just enlighten Oliver Mundell in particular to remember that very many Conservative MPs voted against Theresa May's deal, so you should note that. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, we are committed to protecting Scotland's international academic and research standing, and we will continue to press for the reintroduction of a post-study work route so that people who study in Scotland can continue to build their lives and careers here. We are disappointed by the Tory amendment because at this time, unfortunately, people are leaving. We want them to stay. People aren't coming and aren't as attracted to Scotland as they were. We need to think of new mechanisms to be attractive. So I commend the motion in Richard Lockhead's name to the Parliament and ask Parliament to vote for it unamended. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that concludes our debate on the impact of the UK Government's planned immigration policy and mobility restrictions on Scotland's university and scientific research.